Hello, everybody. Welcome to the March 2018 Take Action webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about considering direct action and civil disobedience tactics in the pro-democracy movement, which sounds like a lot of jargon, but we'll get into that. And this is the first, actually, of a series of webinars that will be conducted every other month during the Take Action webinar time about this topic, and we'll be welcoming other organizations and do a much deeper dive on this topic over the course of the next several months. So tonight is an introduction to this conversation and some broad strokes about direct action and civil disobedience. So thanks for being here. My name is Jessica Munger. I am the programs director at Move to Amend, and I work out of my home in Los Angeles, California, where it's just the dead of winter here, 75 degrees today. And I'm really glad to be here with you having this conversation. I should preface by saying that I am no expert on this topic. There are certainly a lot of things to know and understand about these tactics. And I've done a lot of training myself and have engaged in a lot of these actions, but I'm certainly no expert. So I welcome your feedback and your interest, and I'm excited to have other voices in this conversation as we move forward in the next few months. So if you're having any trouble with the audio right now, you can access some help through the Zoom interface with these numbers here. You could also try calling our national office for some support, 916-318-8040. I'm not really in a position to troubleshoot tech problems during the webinar since I'll be presenting alone tonight, but there are folks at the office in case you need anything. And then this info@zoom.us should be helpful to you too. And we've got Ambrosia on the call, who I hope will text message me if there's any problem with the audio. So our agenda for tonight, as usual, each month we'll do a quick overview of Move to Amend in case there's anyone on the webinar who is not familiar with us and the work we're doing. Then we'll go into some assumptions just to be sure we're clear on a few fundamentals as we begin this important discussion. And then a little bit of an intro into some language, just to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about some things that can be a little jargony, or we want to be sure that we have a shared understanding of these concepts. And then we'll do an introduction to tactics and broad ideas. So this is a very broad overview of some of the seminal understanding and tactics in this field. And then we'll talk about what Move to Amend has done so far in terms of these tactics and what resources we have at our disposal, what's already been happening around the country. And then we'll talk about what's to come in this series as we go forward with other organizations and a deeper dive. And then we'll have some questions that I'd like to offer for us as a group to think about as we move through this process and as we begin to think about using civil disobedience and direct action. And then we'll have time for any questions for me. So getting into a quick overview of Move to Amend. Move to Amend is a coalition of hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals who are committed to social economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that is genuinely accountable to the people and not to corporate interests. The goals specifically of Move to Amend are to pass the We the People Amendment, which is currently HJR 48 in the House of Representatives, to make clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights and that money is not free, protected political speech. However, our other goal is to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make real the promise of American democracy through constitutional renewal. So I want to put a pin in this statement before we start, because to say the phrase through constitutional renewal, I think implies that a constitutional amendment is actually a tactic in itself. The overall goal for our movement and our organization is to realize true democracy and build true democracy. And a tactic that we're using to do that is to amend the Constitution. So I want to start by setting the tone of thinking about goals and tactics as two different things. Tactics being a way to achieve goals. So this is a good place to start. Next, we'll talk quickly about our principles and values. So Move to Amend values and centralizes anti-oppression work and solidarity organizing. This means that we recognize that corporate rule affects different communities and different individuals differently, depending on their situation and their intersecting identities. And so it's important for us, as we're building a broad and deep movement, to be rooted in solidarity with those who are experiencing the harshest manifestations of corporate rule that we're fighting against, and operating in solidarity with them. That goes along with our value of coalition and movement building. We know that what we're trying to do is a mighty, mighty task to amend the Constitution. So in order to do that, we need to build a strong, broad coalition and relationship with organizations and groups who are doing adjacent work, whether it's within the pro-democracy movement specifically or adjacent fronts of struggle, which really all relate back to corporate power, which is at the root of so many of the problems that we're facing and organizing to address. Grassroots organizing is where it's all at for us. We do have our bill in Congress. However, where we put most of our attention and effort and resources is into the grassroots. Our organizers on the ground in affiliates throughout the country are the ones doing the work. They're doing public education, they're passing initiatives and resolutions and engaging in a lot of these tactics in their communities where it's really effective. So grassroots organizing is, we all come from that background at National, and that's really where our priorities are in supporting the grassroots organizing of Move to Amend. We also have a dedication to political education. We believe that if we're going to be strong and strategic, we need to do continuous political education to not only sharpen our analysis, but to learn from history. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more. Today is a great example of the political education being woven into the other parts of our work. It's also really important to us to maintain our political and economic independence. So we don't take big money from large foundations, certainly not from political parties, because we know that with large donations come strings, and that's the very system we're fighting against. And so it's important for us to not be connected to any political party and to maintain the independence of our mission and strategy. Okay, so we're going to talk about some assumptions going into this discussion about civil disobedience and direct action. These assumptions are a jumping off point. So if any of these things are unclear to you or you disagree, that's okay. But this is what I'm operating from to start the discussion today. And if you want to talk about any of these, you could email me later. But we're going to start from here today. Corporations have political and social power, and we are living under corporate rule. Pretty straightforward. Probably everyone on this call knows that we're living under corporate rule and they have unchecked power. We also assume that corporate rule is dangerous to communities, individuals, and the planet on which we depend upon for life itself. We see that in every aspect of our lives. We are invested in resisting corporate rule and the influence of big money in government. Of course, that's why we're here. Where abolishing corporate constitutional rights means fundamental systemic changes. So we have to know that ending corporate personhood is a revolutionary act. This is not going to be a small adjustment. This is not going to be a reform. This is going to change the very systems that we operate within, and the very foundation, really, of how our society is organized. It's a big deal. We also have to assume that we still have some power. I know that I like to be an efficient person, and I don't put my energy places where I feel like it's not efficient. And I believe that we still have power as the people. We've seen that. We've seen legislation change. We've seen culture changes. And we have to know that we are powerful, especially when there's a lot of us. Another assumption is that direct action includes a diversity of tactics. There are a lot of ways that folks engage in direct action. We'll talk about that later. Today, we're going to be discussing nonviolent action, and I'll leave that there. Okay, so let's talk about some language so that we all have a shared understanding of what we're talking about when we say direct action and civil disobedience. These words get tossed around a lot, and for good reason. It's broad. There's a lot of new invention and innovation within this field. So let's just get straight on what we mean. Direct action is a broad term which includes many, many tactics. Direct action may be legal, such as a boycott, a permitted march, a demonstration, or illegal, such as breaking into an animal testing lab to release the animals. Both of those things would be considered direct action. One you can get arrested for, the other, the cops might be present. It can be directed at the state, at corporations, schools, or other institutions of social authority. So part of the process of engaging in direct action includes understanding where the power lies. Sometimes that's political power, sometimes that is cultural power. So I'm sure, I'll give you an example. This past Sunday, I live here in Los Angeles, and the Oscars were happening on Sunday. So I work with a group that's working to abolish the statute of limitations around the country for sexual assault. So we conducted a press conference right outside the Oscars about the complicity of the Academy, and we're calling on the Academy to do certain things to meet our demands. So there's no legal mechanism to get them to do this. What they have is a cultural authority. People look to the Oscars, to the Academy, to the actors for guidance on how to behave and how to think about some of the issues that are facing us. So that's what I mean by social authorities. Direct action can be violent or nonviolent. Outcomes can include visibility, so just getting your name out there, getting your cause out there, getting people to stop and say, what are they doing? It might include law or policy change. It may include a change of behavior, potentially a show of power. So you might get the institution, you might get the Oscars to revoke or the Academy to revoke their membership of certain abusers. That would be a change of behavior. It might be a show of power. Hey, we brought out 200,000 people in the streets today, and we want you to see how powerful we are. We've had some great shows of power within the last 2 years when it comes to marches and huge attendance at some of these national rallies. It could be intimidation, similar to a show of power. It could be as far as revolution and regime change. So there's a large spectrum within direct action that can be aspired to. The other thing about direct action is that it's done conscientiously. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. What is civil disobedience? Again, another term that gets talked about a lot. It is a slightly more narrow definition, and most would say it's a form of direct action. Civil disobedience is a type of direct action. It is not necessarily nonviolent, but nonviolent civil disobedience is the most commonly understood tactic. When you think civil disobedience, you likely think Martin Luther King, Freedom Summer, sit-ins, Gandhi, things like that. And those are some of the examples, but not all. It is inherently illegal. So the word disobedience implies that you are, again, conscientiously engaging in illegal behavior with an end to display a moral objective. So when we talk about doing something conscientiously, I want to give you an example. Getting a speeding ticket is not civil disobedience. It's something, driving too fast, driving over the speed limit is illegal. You're going to get caught, you're going to get a ticket. But your objective matters when it comes to what is civil disobedience. So like I said, getting a speeding ticket is not civil disobedience. However, we had a volunteer several years back who decided to engage in an act of civil disobedience. He printed a corporate charter and he put it in the passenger seat of his car and seat belted it in, and he took to the carpool lane on the freeway in the San Francisco Bay Area. Of course, he gets pulled over. He was fully expecting to be pulled over. And when the officer said, you know, you're driving in a carpool lane by yourself, he said, no, I have a person right here next to me. It's a corporate person. So the idea, of course, he knew he would get a ticket and he would have to, you know, go through the process. He wasn't ever expecting the officer to understand, you know, what he was saying, but rather to make a spectacle and to show the absurdity of corporations as people. So again, intent is an important aspect to civil disobedience and direct action. You can't just do illegal stuff for no reason and call it civil disobedience. Okay, so we're going to talk now about tactics. And what's exciting about tactics is that there's so much room for creativity and improvement. So I'm going to show you a bunch of photos of tactics, and we're going to go through a list that came from the Albert Einstein Institute, and it's called 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action. And you've probably heard of this if you've ever taken a course in direct action or civil disobedience. This is really a seminal list that was put together a long time ago about these most commonly practiced methods. And author Gene Sharp, who is again an important voice in the nonviolent action world, says that tactics fall under three different groups: protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and nonviolent intervention. So we're going to talk about that. The tactics being the specific methods or weapons of nonviolent action. Sounds like a funny juxtaposition of weapons and nonviolent, but that's what I think makes it so powerful. And like I said, these can be classified into protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and nonviolent intervention. So you can check out this list if you Google 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action. You can find it, but you can also, I'll include it in the notes that I send out to folks after this webinar. It's a well-respected list that we're going to use as the basis for our discussion today, but it's not an exhaustive list. So while it's well-revered and while these tactics have been time-tested, there's so many new actions that are coming out through all of the political activism that's happening now, things that might not even have existed at the time that this list was put together. For instance, you know, hacking or die-in, or some of the things that the students are engaging in right now are very creative. So I'll put that out there as we look at some of the more historic examples. And I also want to say, as we get into tactics, I've indicated with a little star asterisk the tactics that we're already using at Move to Amend or have used in the past. So you can look out for that in these coming slides. But I also want to remind you that you're already engaging in nonviolent direct action. Move to Amend existing, in my opinion, is an act of nonviolent direct action. We are organized with the goal of making a change, a large systemic change to an existing structure. That means that us existing and being here tonight, we're already doing this. So if nonviolent civil disobedience or direct action feels daunting to you, it's okay, you're already at it. Okay, so these first types of actions, of tactics, include methods of protest and persuasion. So this includes formal statements, including public speeches, public statements. So you can see here that Move to Amend is already engaging in a lot of these. Of course, public speeches, letters of opposition, declarations, mass petitions, right? We have about 500,000 folks signed on to our petition. Symbols, leaflets. You also have communications with a wider audience. So again, public picketing, mock elections, mock awards, anything that sort of communicates with a wider audience. And often that has to do with satire or, some of these things can be really fun in terms of, being creative about demonstrating the absurdity of something that you're resisting. This picture here is a photo of a picket line. Okay, then we have group presentations, symbolic public acts, and pressures on individuals. So you can see here displays of flags, symbolic colors. This flag here was created by Adbusters. You may have seen it before, and this is a great example of a symbolic flag that I think makes a very bold statement. The United States is, what is it made of? It's made of corporate power. Those are the stars. So I think that it really hits home and is a good example of some of these. Humorous skits and pranks. We're really good at that, I gotta say, at Move to Amend. I'll show you later some of the tactics that we've used before, including some really interesting satire and skits. Of course, marches, parades. If you've been to an impeachment march or the Women's March or May Day March or anything like that, you've already participated in civil disobedience and direct action. Symbolic lights. You might have been part of an overpass light display. We'll talk about some of that later. This photo here is Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. So this is a good example of direct action. What Colin Kaepernick did was not illegal. However, it was a sort of a strong message based on his timing and the way that he held his body in that space. It's a great example. A lot of these actions have to do with putting our physical bodies out there in order to demonstrate mass power. Not all of them, certainly, but this is an example of one of them. And just by taking this very simple legal action, it's caused quite a stir and been quite impactful. So sometimes very simple things that are still legal can have a great impact. So we've got the social boycott here. We've got suspension of social and sports activities. We're seeing a lot of athletes take a stand, or rather take a knee right now. We've got, let's see, drama and music, processions, honoring the dead. That's been used a lot recently as we're mourning so many deaths that were unnecessary for a variety of different reasons. That can be really impactful. Again, these stars here indicating things that Move to Amend already engages in. So teach-ins, that's another good one. I'm sure that's a familiar one to folks who have studied the civil rights movement at all. Really interesting walkouts. There's a giant student walkout staged for April 20th. Students all over the country to demonstrate not only as a show of power, but to demonstrate that they care and understand gun rights, or the gun violence, and want to demonstrate their power as a body of students, which I think is really lovely, and I'm excited to see that. Let's see. Sanctuary, you may have heard of some of that around the news lately. So a lot of these fall under the category of non-cooperation. So you can see Colin Kaepernick, again, is a great example of the general umbrella of non-cooperation. Often can be passive. You're not doing something rather than doing something can also be very impactful. So there's ostracism of people, non-cooperation with social events, customs, and institutions, and withdrawal from the social system. So, you know, that includes staying at home, total personal non-cooperation. I think it was last year, maybe the year before, there was a women's strike where women all over in many different industries decided to not go to work that day, to demonstrate the power that women in the workforce have in terms of the economy and the world going round. So we've seen some of these lately. And again, you know, intention matters here. So I'd love to think that having a lazy Saturday at home was doing something politically helpful, but really me staying home from something doesn't mean much unless a bunch of other people are doing it with me and we have an intention and a desired outcome. So the context of these actions is really important when we're considering, you know, what's effective and what even is direct action. Next, we have economic boycotts. So methods of economic non-cooperation. So we have actions by consumers. This looks like, you know, an economic boycott is the refusal to buy, sell, handle, or distribute specific goods and services. So there are these actions by consumers. You may have participated in a number of these. The BDS movement is a great example. Rent withholding. Again, some of these things, there's debate about what is efficient and what is effective. And what I do know is that consumer boycotts can only be effective if there's mass participation, because you not buying one pair of Nike sneakers really doesn't make a difference. But if there's mass protest and boycott, that often can, you know, cause a hit for a specific business or company. And the important thing in those cases is to be clear about why, and to make your messaging clear about why you're boycotting if you're going to engage in economic boycotts. And then we have actions by workers and producers. So these are people who are consuming products. These are people who are creating them. So workmen's boycott, producers boycott, etc. And then you have actions by middlemen. So suppliers and handlers. Let's see, you can also have actions by owners and management. So that could be a trader's boycott, refusal to let or sell property, lockout, a merchant's general strike. You also have action by holders of financial resources. So you might remember during the height of the No DAPL movement, there's a large push for folks to divest their money in banks that were supporting the pipeline, and that I think had a pretty good effect, because not only were individuals doing it, but individuals were calling on their cities to do it. So, you know, there were several cities who divested from banks and other institutions who had money in the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that was an incredible show of power, and also had a very significant impact, I think, on the people who were engaging in that action, because they saw that they could have some say in the financial investments of their city. And even though the pipeline was still built, it means that we have ground, and you know, we do have these mechanisms that we can use. Let's see, refusal to pay fees, dues, assessments. You also have actions by governments. So things like a domestic embargo, blacklisting of traders, international sellers embargo, lots of things like that. Then you've got the methods of economic non-cooperation, like the strike. So you've got symbolic strikes, like a protest strike, quick walkout, agricultural strikes like farm workers and peasant strikes, strikes by special groups. I'm really interested in this story right now that with the teachers who have shut down all the public schools in West Virginia and are really showing their power in a way that is beautiful. They know that they're needed and that their work is important and that they have leverage and they're using it. So I'm sure we've all seen the implications of a strike. Then there's the ordinary industrial strike. So suspension of work in all the establishments of an industry, or maybe an establishment strike in one or more plants under one management. Again, the coordination and strategy behind these strikes and boycotts is extremely important. I think maybe somewhat more than in any other realm of tactics, because boycotts just don't mean much unless there is mass action and coordinated action. So again, if 3 employees don't show up for work in the plant, that, they'll likely just get fired. But if, maybe suspension of work in all the establishments of an industry, that's going to have quite an impact. Or if, all the administrators and public school teachers in the state of West Virginia go on strike, there you have power. There's also restricted strikes. So the union strikes only one firm at an industry at a time, carrying out of regulations in order to slow production. Sicken is what they call mass action of reporting sick. Strike by resignation, a significant number of workers resign individually. Selective strikes. There's also multi-industry strikes. So several industries are striking simultaneously. And then we've all heard of a general strike. And then there's a combination of these. So economic shutdowns, and these can have mass consequences because, as we know, money is what drives most things. Okay, we also have methods of political non-cooperation. So we've got boycotts of elections, boycott of government employment, withdrawal from governmental education, withholding allegiance, reluctant compliance, general administrative non-cooperation. There are a lot of things in here that are within the citizens' alternatives to obedience, so things that general public can engage in, as well as actions by government personnel and bureaucrats, which is also a really important part of blocking up systems, creating disruption within either an industry or a government body. And those people have a lot of power because the bureaucrats who make things happen, who do the nitty-gritty work, they're workers, and if we can harness that power, they have great strength. There are domestic governmental actions that can be taken, such as withdrawal from international organizations or refusal of membership in international bodies. And we've seen examples of that recently as well. And then, of course, international government action. So changes in diplomatic and other representation, delay and cancellation of diplomatic events, etc. And of course, these governmental and international actions can't be used all the time, right? Because it depends who's wielding the power and who we are resisting. But this, again, is a pretty extensive list. Okay, then we have methods of nonviolent intervention. So you've got self-exposure to the elements, the fast, hunger strikes, sit-ins, stand-ins, again, like using your body, so physical and psychological interventions. The fast, again, has been used in a lot of different ways. And we've seen that fasts are effective if they are engaged in mass numbers and or have a lot of media presence and support. One person, well, it depends what your scope is as well. So scope is another really important part of strategizing for an action. How big are you going, and what is the institution that you are resisting? So these photos here are some examples. Of course, you've got a classic sit-in lunch counter up there from Freedom Summers. We've got a pray-in happening up at the top right-hand corner, where you can see clergy people gathered to do a pray-in. We've got this Starving for Justice photo down here of people in prison, an inmate jumpers, indicating a hunger strike. And then we've got the Occupy Wall Street, which utilized many of these tactics. And I want to take a second and talk about some of these nonviolent occupations and harassment. So we're going to circle back once or twice at least during this series about the question of what is violence. But what I want to say here is that I had the opportunity of learning this fall from Dr. Reverend James Lawson, who was a civil rights leader and colleague of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And one thing that really stood out to me was that during the Freedom Summer and other associated civil rights actions, those folks had to endure so much harassment. And it really struck me that nonviolence is a tactic more than anything else. Nonviolence is respectable, and it commands the person or people engaging in it to be extremely disciplined and to endure a lot of harassment, physical violence, name calling. Like the people who engaged in these sit-ins endured some really nasty stuff and had a dedication to the tactic of nonviolence. So that doesn't mean that those students didn't go home and be really angry and yell about it, and that doesn't mean they didn't feel even violent things. It just means that for that action they had committed to nonviolence as a show of strength. And so that's a choice that we can make, and it's not necessarily it doesn't mean that, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr. was always himself a nonviolent person. What it means is that he utilized the tactic of nonviolence in a very strategic way. Some of these other tactics include again, overloading administrative systems. So clogging up the resources of the state. We saw something that I thought was interesting during the Standing Rock, the height of the Standing Rock encampment was that they just kept arresting people, and the state was running out of resources. They didn't have any more jail cells. They were spending a lot of money tear gassing nonviolent protesters, and they really drained the state because they just kept being arrested and they kept stressing the resources. So that's just one recent example, and there are many. Again, some of these are at different levels of risk than others. Again, direct action can be legal or illegal, and even when you're doing legal things, often people are arrested for doing legal things. So that doesn't necessarily mean that even if it's legal, you won't be arrested, or that there's not risk of arrest. And we'll get into more about that as we go forward. But it's important to know that anyone who is choosing to engage in these tactics should be well aware of the legal possibilities and take that very seriously. And to know that not everyone is in a position to be arrested. And so those of us who choose to engage in actions where there's a risk of arrest have to understand that not everyone is in a position to do that, and that it's a conscious choice. So why are we talking about this? Why is Move to Amend even having this conversation? Well, I think for a lot of good reasons. People's movements inherently use direct action. I challenge anyone who can think of one. I spent a lot of time trying to think of a movement that didn't use any direct action. And what I came to is that it's inherent. So like I said, I think that move to amend existing is a tactic. I think that we can see that in order to resist an existing institution and make any change, you would have to employ at least one of these tactics, whether that's just having a petition or a public speech or rally. So if that's the case, which I think it is, we want to know what we're doing. We want to be as strategic as possible. And there's a quote from Gene Sharp that I'd like to read you. He says that in his book, How Nonviolent Struggle Works, he says regarding the technique of nonviolent action, it has usually been practiced under highly unfavorable conditions and with a lack of experienced participants or even experienced leaders. Almost always, there was no advanced preparations or training and little to no planning and no or limited prior consideration of strategy, tactics, and possible methods. So what he's getting at here is that people engage in direct action and civil disobedience because they're trying to survive, because they have to, because it's that or death. And we're in a position here where we have the space and time and resources to be strategic and to learn and to train ourselves and plan so that we might be able to use these tactics in the most effective way. So it doesn't make sense for us not to study these things, no matter how we end up using them in the course of the amendment movement. We try to learn lessons from past movements. So again, with our dedication to political education, we're always reading about the tactics that they used in other movements and what worked and what didn't, and what could have worked better, you know, who got left out, all of these things, and there's just so much to learn. I love the phrase that we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and I feel that way so much when it comes to talking about direct action and civil disobedience, because there are so many historical examples of people who either, you know, planned and trained for this and had strategy, or people who just did it because they were trying to survive. So we like to learn. Also, we know that winning means escalating. It's a fact that I think we're going to have to face at some point, which is that our 10-year strategic plan says that we should be able to amend the Constitution within 10 years. Between now and then, things are likely going to change a lot. We're already seeing an emerging fascist state. We're seeing late-stage capitalism. We're seeing things collapse and other things take power. And what that means is that we at some point have to escalate. This is not going to be easy. Corporations and our opposition are well-funded and you know, have existing power. So we are not going to be able to win by giving public speeches and passing around a petition. Those things are tactics and organizing tools, but likely we're going to have to escalate. The question is, how do we do that? Because our movement is so broad, and corporate rule is such a large and often confusing and kind of amorphic opposition. So how do we not focus on, you know, the problem is not Walmart, the problem is not Monsanto, the problem is corporate rule. However, there need to be these symbolic displays of power and seizing of power that it's really hard to target at corporations in general. So we want to have this conversation because we want to brainstorm with you. We want to have this conversation as an organization. What would it look like to use these tactics with such a broad goal and mission? And I think we've done some of that pretty effectively, but we really want to hear what you think, what your affiliates are doing, and how you see that changing over the course of the next 10 years. Where are your boundaries? What are you comfortable with? What do you want to learn more about? We want to be as prepared and strategic as possible. That's our style. We want to be good at what we're doing, and we've got a broad coalition, and we want to tap those resources to learn more about this. So what have we done so far as Move to Amend? We have passed initiatives and resolutions. Let's see, I think we have 400-ish ballot initiatives, which have passed with citizens' votes. We have over 700 resolutions all around the country. They pass every single time. That's a very important and strategic tactic, especially because of the things that I described earlier with the scope of our goals. That's a really concrete way to show power on the local level. Of course, the petition. We've done plenty of theater and puppetry and really creative stuff. There are a collection of songs that are written either specifically about Move to Amend or about corporate power. We've got lots of cool music-related tactics. People's lobbying. I know for me, one of the most exciting moments in Move to Amend was at the 2016 Leadership Summit, where we took a bus full of 60 volunteers who had never lobbied before, and we let loose on the halls of Congress and flooded the Hill, and it was really empowering. We've done a lot of teach-ins, again, a tactic that was used a lot in the civil rights era. Public speeches, our barnstorming tours are a tactic for sure. Marches, rallies, again, so many of these you've all engaged in yourselves. Mock birthday, we had a sarcastic birthday party when the the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad court case, which first established corporate constitutional rights, when that turned 130. So that was really kind of fun and satirical. Again, parties and celebrations, overpass light displays. You've probably seen that at least through Backbone campaign, banners, display flags, light projections, all kinds. Here's just some photos. There's Ambrosia, who I know is on the line tonight, doing citizens lobbying. We've got down here in the right-hand corner, this is the 28th Amendment banner that was made for us by Backbone campaign and is currently touring around the country. It's currently in Sarasota, Florida, where they're using it for actions. You know, it's a really engaging piece of art that people can come up to and directly touch and engage with, which is really helpful. The center picture here is a corporate wedding. So again, these mockeries of what would it be like to have, you know, a person marry a corporation. That's ludicrous. And so having these public displays of absurdity, I think, is really fun. And then up here in the top right-hand corner, we have folks out doing a freeway banner display. They created this banner themselves with really simple materials, and they get out there and get the message to everyone who's driving beneath them on the freeway. And then this bottom photo here in the center is a skit that we've done called the Miss Democracy pageant. So again, it's satirizing the you know, Miss Democracy with like a Miss America type thing. So a lot of these actions we have resources about on our website in the toolkit. If you go to movetoamend.org/toolkit, you can find a lot of this stuff. Here we've got this top right-hand corner is a picture of this overpass light display. This again, is a product of Backbone campaign, and I've done this a few times myself. It's really fun and it's really effective, and it gets a lot of people to ask questions. And you can display that, you know, over a freeway or just in front of a building here, like these folks. And then you can see above them, there's the projected light message, get money out of politics. And that's the light projection that we were talking about, which is also a project of the Backbone campaign. So we have access to all these things. And in fact, the large image of the 28th Amendment that's down here, that's touring the country, also comes with a set of these light displays. So you can sort of do a joint action with that. In the left-hand corner, top left-hand corner, we've got this this affiliate who is tabling, and they have their corporate person costume out there. We really like that one. You can see it down at the bottom too. The middle photo is Caitlin and Shelley, and that's Shelly Solomon, and one of our interns, Erin, who was dressed up like a corporate person for Halloween. And you can see the Goldman Sachs character with Mr. Moneybags. That guy with the big head was a creation of some folks in Minnesota who take that image with them, and it's really, draws people in, and it's a good way to get folks to come over to the table and see what that's about. Okay, so just to recap what resources we already have. We've got the petition, of course, circulate widely. We've got resolutions and initiatives and plenty of resources to help you pull those things off in your community. Lots of lobbying materials to empower you to feel confident in doing that. Bird dogging, we didn't talk about that much, but we will talk about it more later, which is a tactic to get the attention of candidates or electeds and make them answer questions publicly. There's graphics and templates, teach-ins and film screening, help to organize those things, skits and scripts for all of the things that you saw on the previous slide. Costumes and characters, there's a whole script for the corporate wedding that you saw, and instructions for how to make the corporate person costume. You just need some boxes and tape and paint. Then we've got Action in a Box, which is the project I was describing with Backbone campaign. That includes the giant 28th Amendment and also the overpass light displays. We also have our caucuses, which are really a resource to us. We've got folks who want to do work with organized labor, with education, with arts and culture, and with communities of faith. And so those caucuses are really ripe places for some of these tactics to take hold, especially because those folks know their sectors and know what might be effective at showing power within them. We also have a really broad coalition. We are a coalition organization, and we've got lots of really great folks who support us and support our work who have expertise in this. And so that's one reason we're conducting this series of webinars, which will happen every other month, to learn from them. I should say also that there will be Take Action webinars in between these, but every other month will be within this topic. Okay, and so further, what can we expect from this series? Concrete action ideas. So some of the tactics that we just briefly went over today, we can show you how those have played out, in actual campaigns and instances, including some new ideas. Some of the organizations who are coming on to talk to us have done really creative and inventive things. So I'm excited about that. Information on strategizing and planning actions. So there's tons of work that goes into pulling off a direct action. For instance, a lot of people think that Rosa Parks just was tired on the bus that day and didn't want to deal with it. But actually, that's not what's happening at all. There was a well-coordinated, planned, and strategic campaign of people behind her. She was selected specifically to do this job. She went through a lot of training to pull off this day that I think a lot of people still think she just sat down and happened to start this, this big thing rolling, when that's not the case at all. So we'll talk about what are the important considerations for planning your own events and make you feel empowered and not so overwhelmed if you wanted to pull something off. We'll talk about theory, of course. We did, I guess, a little today, but not overwhelming on theory. Meeting organizations who specialize in this work. Again, we'll definitely have Backbone campaign in here. We're likely going to have a representative from Beautiful Trouble and other organizations who will share with us. Inspiration and brainstorming for ways that we can use civil disobedience and direct action. So like I said, I want you to sit with all of this stuff. What stood out to you? How does it make you feel? What are some things you might want to try? What are some things that feel outside of your comfort zone but might, you might move on that a little bit. So brainstorming is always good. And then I want to offer some questions for us to consider as we go through this. What civil disobedience or direct action have you participated in yourself? So look through that list and think about what have you done. It's probably a lot more than you might have thought beforehand. How might we use a wider range of tactics as an organization or movement? So I've talked about that already. What are targets in your community? Where's the local power? What might be a good symbolic institution or social authority to target locally that you could use to draw the connection between corporate power and the larger problems that exist outside of your community as well? And then this question that I think is often missing from a lot of the conversations about direct action and civil disobedience, and that is, what is violence? I've honestly never gotten a solid answer on this from all of the experts I've ever talked to about direct action. Some people, and I think that it's a very personal question, some people consider property damage violence, breaking windows. Some people would consider denying the country healthcare would be violence. You know, there's a lot of different ways to think about that. So I just encourage you to think about that for yourself and to consider maybe, you know, thinking about that in a slightly different way than it's used often in the media. Okay, so here's some of my sources in case you were wondering, and this will be again on the recording in case you want to go back and check any of this out. Okay, and then we've got these next steps, and I'll tell you these before I stop sharing my screen and take some questions. Next step is to complete the survey. You should see a survey come up for you when I end this webinar, just for a little bit of feedback. And then if you have any questions, get in touch with us, info@movetoamend.org, or you can call the phone number here. You can also email me directly. My email is jessica@movetoamend.org, and I'm sort of spearheading this project. So if you have other organizations who you think of that you have a connection with, might want to be part of it, get in touch if you want to. The next webinar in general is the next Take Action webinar, I should say, is Tuesday, April 3rd. And that will be on a topic that's different than this. But the next webinar in this series on civil disobedience and direct action is May Day, my favorite day of the year, Tuesday, May 1st. And what an appropriate day for us to be talking about direct action. We also have a couple of other webinars coming up within the month that I'll just plug here because I'm excited about them. And we've got 2 webinars coming up on March 25th and 29th about intersectionality and inclusivity in the pro-democracy movement. And that should be a really rich conversation with a bunch of other organizations who have great insight onto that topic. So this is my first time using Zoom, so I'm going to attempt to answer your questions in the chat bar. So excuse me if this is a little clunky. Okay, I'm gonna come over to stop my screen share here. Okay, there we go. Okay, and I don't see any questions in the chat here, but if anyone does have questions, I would love to hear them. Thanks, Jennifer. And if you think of questions after the webinar, like I said, feel free to call or email. And I'm really excited to hear what you all are thinking about this conversation in general and how we can go forward as a movement. So if there aren't any questions, I will say thanks again so much for your time tonight and for your work in general and being part of this movement. It's really a pleasure to be in company with so many of you doing great work. So thanks again, and I will talk to you in May. And have a great night, everybody.